pastors here at Crossroads, and we're going to continue our series. I'm going to invite you to turn to Joshua chapter 3. If you open your Bible, you turn pretty much all the way to the left. It's just after Deuteronomy. We're going to be looking at one of the really, it's a big red letter Old Testament narratives. This is one of the ones that they love to teach in the Sunday school classes, but I promise you, there's a lot more going on here. So we're going to read the entire chapter. It's only 17 verses. The words will be on the screen. I'd invite you to follow along. If you've got your Bible, feel free to make some notes, underline stuff. All right, here we go. Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan where they had camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Joshua told the people, "Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you." Joshua said to the priests, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on ahead of the people." So they took it up and went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the ark of the covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river." Joshua said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap." So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage during the harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. This is the word of the Lord. So a little bit of a recap, briefly. Where are we in the story? Moses, the greatest human leader history has ever known, their champion, the one who brokered their release from Pharaoh, the one who stood as an intermediary between them and God, the one who had maintained them in 40 years of wilderness wandering, the one who had led them right up to the banks of the Jordan, where 40 years before it, their parents had all lost their nerve. This man is dead. And now Joshua, God is now working through a different human leader, Joshua. So, if you will, try to transport yourself right now into the shoes of the Israelites. Just for a minute. In your mind's eye, I'd like you to go there. You have been approaching the Jordan for days and weeks. You already have a couple of military conquests in the rearview mirror. You've toppled some opponents, some kingdoms that you had no business toppling. So God is with you. But you've been approaching the Jordan now for weeks and weeks. And it is at flood stage. This is important, all right? It is at flood stage. This is impassable. Now, most of the year, the Jordan looks like something we might call a creek. You know, like Stevens Creek. You could most days you could wade through Stevens Creek if you weren't worried about hepatitis or anything like that. You could wade through Stevens Creek, and most of the year that's what the Jordan looks like. However, the narrator drops it right in there in verse 15, just as a little aside, the Jordan's at flood stage. This is an important detail. Normally a creek, normally a couple of yards wide. Now the Jordan River is a quarter-mile wide wall of water, sediment, and debris. It is rapids. It is churning brown death. That's what they're facing. And so can you imagine the moms, right? I mean, seriously. Gathering your children. Look at the children. How am I going to get these kids across this river? My family. What about the dads? This is not a battle-hardened army. This is a bunch of refugees. There are women and children and elderly and livestock and the aggregate of 40 years of wilderness wanderings, and they're approaching this insurmountable obstacle. And they got to be quaking in their boots. What about the dads? Dads? What happens when you face an obstacle that outstrips your intellect, ability, and tools? What do? You freak out. That's what I do. The point of this passage, the point of Joshua chapter 3, in fact, the point of all of Joshua, it's a reoccurring theme, is that we all have a Jordan in front of us. If you've lived long enough, you've stood at the banks of a Jordan. An obstacle that's impassable, horrifying, outstrips your resources, intellect, ability, tools, experience. Something you could not possibly cross apart from some kind of miraculous intervention. If you've lived long enough, you've stood at the banks of the Jordan. The point of this passage is that if God leads you to the banks of the Jordan, He is the living God who goes before you, and He never leaves you, and He never forsakes you. That is the point. And I'm putting my cards on the table right now, and let's look at it. Let's look at this uncrossable river, this impenetrable obstacle. Now, Israel's coming from the west, they're coming from the east, and they're crossing over to the west. Jericho is on the western shore of the Jordan, and so what this is a story, it is a story of military conquest, 100%. That is the subplot. The main plot, I want you to see this. This is a theological punch in the nose. That's what this is. This is provocation. Let's explain. Jericho is a Canaanite city. The Canaanites worshipped several ancient Near Eastern deities, the most prominent of which was a deity by the name of Baal. He's big in the Old Testament. He seems like one of the competing deities that God's people are always kind of bumping up against. This is a Canaanite city. They worship Baal. Baal had a couple of monikers. He was called the Lord of the Rain and Dew and the Prince of the Earth. The thing you need to know about Baal is that he dies every fall. He's a seasonal deity, right? He's subject, and he's resurrected in the spring, and he brings the spring rains, and it swells the Jordan River, and the river flows. So what is happening right here is this is provocation. This is God through His people displaying His sovereignty and His power. He's leading His people up to this impenetrable, impassable obstacle. And what I want to point out the why. This is the why. Because a lot of us end up at the banks of the Jordan, and we end up asking why. And the answer we usually assume is God's hand is off the wheel. God's not with me. I'm outside of His will, because how else would I have ended up here in front of this impassable obstacle, whatever your white, raging, debris-filled brown wall of death is. Okay? And so when we end up on the banks of the river, we think, I must be outside of God's will. I must have done something. He must be mad at me. He's taken His hands off the wheel of my life. And one of the testaments of this chapter is that may not necessarily be true. There's an interesting place in here where God commands His people. He says, you're gonna actually walk 2,000 cubits. This is in verse 4. It says, then you will know which way to go, since you have not been this way before. And He says, keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. It's about a half mile. Now, there's probably hundreds of thousands of people in Israel's camp. It's important detail, tuck it away for later. The reason that God tells them to stay a half mile away from the ark, he gives it to us because you have not been this way before. It is so everybody can see it. It is so all of Israel can see it. Now, I want to bring up another point about the text right here. The narrator has been very intentional so far about relativizing Joshua. Joshua, we would assume, the book's named Joshua, we would assume he's the hero of the story, wouldn't we? But almost as soon as Joshua is commissioned, what happens is the narrator shifts the focus, and what happens, Joshua doesn't walk into the river. That would have been a great way to confer authority upon him, wouldn't you agree? Like, this cat walks in the middle of the river, and then just the water stops up. He looks a lot like Moses. We've seen this one. He doesn't do that at all. He sends the ark, the symbol of his covenant love. He doesn't send Joshua. He doesn't send the human leader. He sends the visible, tactile, touchable presence in the reminder of his covenantal love for his people. And he sends that into the middle of the river. And it is that presence which causes the water to heap up 20 miles upstream. And he does it, and he says, stay a half mile away, 2,000 cubits away, so everyone can see it. So all of Israel can see it. Why? Their parents had lost their nerve. They'd caved 4 years before because they didn't have the faith. They doubted the promise and the provision and the providence of God. And they crumbled and they caved. And it resulted in 40 years of wilderness wandering. And here they are again. They're children on the same banks. And here they're being called to faith. They're being called to hope. They're being called to trust the covenant love of God. Now, if there's an application for us here, it's this. Just because you find yourselves on the bank of the Jordan, whatever your Jordan looks like, and it might be loss, it might be challenge, it might be addiction. When you're standing on the bank of that river, it's natural. It's an impulse to think God has taken his hands off the wheel of my life. The Holy Spirit has left the building, and I am clearly outside of God's will, or else I wouldn't be standing here looking at destruction. But you have to allow for the possibility that if you find yourself standing at the river's edge, it means you're exactly in the middle of God's will. This is what Israel's doing. And the reason he has brought you to the edge, the reason he has brought you to the banks is so that his power, his might, his love, his provision can be displayed in your life. If you never step out in faith, you never give God the opportunity to do something miraculous. Now, let me I'll just, by way of a personal example, many years ago, I was working at a Christian high school. I was, kind of doing the ministry component. Carol and I worked there together for many years. And it was a big job. After a couple of years, I had it spinning like a top, spreadsheet, everything. That's how I roll. And I was in the gym one day on my lunch break, pedaling the bike, and I was reading Forgotten God by Francis Chan. And it's somewhere around chapter 5. It asks the question. It says, are you doing anything right now that if God did not intervene in a miraculous way, you had no hope of being successful? And I thought about that question. I sat there and I pondered it as I pedaled and sweat. And I came to the conclusion that no, actually. I actually think I could be quite successful without God showing up in any sort of miraculous way. I didn't get the trains to run on time. And it convicted me. And I thought, I'm not really doing anything. I haven't been bold enough so that if I were to be successful in this ministry, it would absolutely God to show up in really miraculous ways. And then, that whole little interaction, that whole little psychological interchange with myself eventually led me to going back into church ministry, and then God led me here where I got my Jordan. And I know if you've been around this church at all, you've heard me talk about it. This actually, next week I'll be the start of my 8th year here. And the first 4 were just one Jordan River after the other. And there were many times, I know many of you sitting here, you're like, this place seems put together, and we got it all together. There were a lot of seasons where I thought this church was going to become townhomes. And it was one after another. And I was I think I was like in my early 40s when I got called to this church. And even then I was too immature to understand what God was doing. Because he kept leading us up to the Jordan. And I thought, oh no, this guy is falling. And I would freak out. Thank goodness I have elders who are older. And they would talk me off of whatever ledge I was on. But then God kept showing up time and time again in ways that, it's just one December, $100,000 fell out of the sky. And I kept seeing it over and over. And so now you know what happens, because we do not exhaust our existential threats as an organization. They just come around every 3 months. And so now when they happen, you know what we do in our elder meetings? I wonder what he's going to do next. Oh, the sky is falling. The bills are piling up. We're not going to make it. The water main blew. It's $100,000. And we sit, so normally I would be freaking out and they'd be talking me down. But now we just look at each other and we smile. And then there's Dan with a twinkle in his eye, and Donovan, who's a lunatic who goes to the first service. And they just smile with a twinkle in their eye, and they go, I wonder what he's going to do next. Because we've seen it. We've had Jordans over and over. And when you step into the Jordan and all of a sudden the living God goes before you, oh, now when the sky is falling and the roof caves in, I'm like, wow, I wonder what he's going to do next. And there's a lot of us that live off of legacy faith. We point back to something that happened in the lives of our parents or our grandparents or even the church in a previous generation. And we say, wow, yeah, look at that. God did something there. But you don't have your own Jordan. You don't have your own Jordan. And sometimes, not always, it's because of the lack of the confidence to take that first step. You notice that the priest had to step into the river before the river was stopped up. And by the way, this is a retelling of the Exodus, the Exodus miracle, the parting of the Red Sea. Most of the miracles in Joshua all point to this. There's Rahab hanging the scarlet cord over her window. That's the blood of the Passover lamb. There's the parting. There's God stopping up the Jordan. Looks a lot like the parting of the Red Sea. What is he doing? It looks a lot alike, but not identical. This is God working through Abraham, and this is God working through Moses, and this is God working through Joshua. Flawed, failed men. We tend to put we give human leaders a lot of credit. Oh, they're smart, they're charismatic, they're winsome, they're good problem solvers. The point of this story, and the reason Joshua is not the hero, is that God is the hero. God is working through Abraham, he's working through Moses, he's working through Joshua. If these patriarchs, if these heroes of the faith understood the relationship that Christians have to God through Jesus Christ and how they were infilled with the Holy Spirit, the power of God. If Abraham, Moses, and Joshua understood Christian theology, their jaws would drop, their eyes would pop out of their heads. Because we have God with us in a way that they could scarcely comprehend. So when you find yourselves at the bank of your Jordan, the point is this. There is a God who is faithful and he goes before you. I want to make one other, I don't want to draw this out, but the Canaanites worship Baal. Baal's a seasonal god. Baal is an off switch. In the fall, Baal dies, and in the spring, he renews. He's like kind of resurrected. And we snicker at the thought of these gods, but look, here's how you know it's a fake god. Here's how you know it's an idol. It's got an off switch. It has an off season. The point of this, and by the way, here they are approaching the Jericho, approaching this Canaanite city. They worship Baal. Baal's at the height of his power because the floodwaters it's at its height. And so there's no way that this ragtag group of Semitic nomads are going to cross this river. We're in a fortified position. We've got a seasoned, battle-hardened army. Their God had an off switch. So do ours. There's a lot of us that the most ascendant guiding principle in our life is money. It's got an off switch, don't it? Some of you know, if you've been around long enough, you might have lost a fortune. Right? Beauty. Strength. Turns out that has an off switch too. Right? All of the things that we chase, the preeminent heuristic, the reason we make decisions, if it is anything other than love and admiration and loyalty to the true God, the Bible calls those things idols. And the way you know it's an idol is it's got an off switch. Throughout the passage, 3 times, God has a lot of different names in the Hebrew Scriptures. The Hebrew people were a little hesitant to use the holy name of God. We would say Yahweh. So they have all these other names for God. And here we get a very interesting name of God. And this is the place where it shows up most prominently. And it is in verse 10. It's in several other places, but in verse 10, it says, "This is how you will know that the living God is among you." El-Hay, the living God. This is a God who doesn't have an off switch. This is a God who is not subject to nature. This is not a God who is a part of nature and therefore has these seasons of being alive and being dead. No. This is a God who is over nature. In fact, big theme through the book of Joshua, many of the miracles that God shows his people actually stop up rivers and freeze the sun in the sky. He's displaying that he is not a part of nature, but he is over nature. And all of these other ancient Near Eastern deities, the Canaanite gods, that was child's play. He is the living God, and he doesn't have an off switch. He doesn't have an off season. He is always there. And nature submits itself to his will. Now, there's one application. Israel was called to the edge, called to follow, called to obedience, called to faithfulness so that they would know that the living God was with them, that the living God went before them. A couple of things that I want to point out about this. There is where he says, consecrate yourselves. Joshua tells them to go consecrate themselves. Now, that's interesting on a couple of levels. Now, this would have been really familiar ancient Near Eastern language. Every nation, every religion, every people group had a provision. If you wanted to approach a god or gods, you would consecrate yourself. And a lot of times that looks like sacrifices or ritual bathing or something like that. And then, once you had become clean, once you had consecrated yourselves, you would approach the deity, whichever one it happened to be, and then you would beseech the deity to grant your request. Crops, children, rain, something like that. Here, this is very interesting. In verse 5, Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Every single religion, every paradigm for satisfying a deity is built around this idea that you're going to consecrate yourself. You're going to purify yourself, ritual bathings or sacrifice or service or something like that. And only then, after you had ponied up, can you approach God. Do you see the inversion? It's shocking. This would have made everybody's eyebrows stand up. Wait a second. God has already promised wonder. God has already said he's going to deliver you. God has already given you the miracle. And now he's saying, in light of that, go consecrate yourselves. Do you see it? Do you see it? Every other religion says, go and try to appease God. Go and try to earn his love. Go and try to earn his mercy. Work really, really hard, and maybe, just maybe, you'll earn it, you'll deserve it. This is the opposite of religion. This is grace. Grace is a Greek word that means gift, and that is precisely what you're seeing here. And none of the original hearers of this story would have had the texture to understand this. This was pointing to a future moment in time where the better Joshua would satisfy God's wrath and cross through the river that none of us could hope to cross through on our own. God says, go. I've already done it. I've already done it. I've loved you. I've given you my mercy. I've gone before you. I've walked into the raging waters. I have faced the flood. Now go consecrate yourselves. I was trying to explain this the other day, and the difference between Christianity and other major religions. In other major religions, you offer your sacrifices on the way to the altar. You go to an altar, and you offer a sacrifice, and then, right, you go on with your life. Then God blesses you. In Christianity, you don't offer your sacrifices on the way in. You offer your sacrifices on the way out. You go before God, not because of anything you're bringing him, because of what Jesus laid down. Jesus paid with his blood. That payment, that sacrifice. You go before God on the basis of his sacrifice. And now, you've been blessed. You are loved. You've received his grace. You've received his mercy. All the things that you would have had to sacrifice and consecrate for, Jesus has done it. And he says, now you go offer your sacrifices on the way out. You live a life of grace and mercy and forgiveness and generosity and kindness on the way out. Now, we have to get to the fulfillment. There's an obstacle that nobody can hope to pass. There is a living God that goes before you. And now we get to the fulfillment. Joshua, as I've stated, is not the hero of the story. In fact, the entire story, the entire Torah, I would argue, all the episodes, everything from Adam in the garden to Moses in the Exodus to Joshua at the Jordan, these are all prefiguring a future miracle that nobody would have been able to comprehend. Not to put too fine a point on it, in verses 14 to 17, I just want to point out something. The water is stopped. It's heaped up. It's heaped up where? At a town called Adam. Adam is the Hebrew word. Any Hebrew hearing that would have been like, oh, Genesis. Adam. Adam is a proper name for Adam in Genesis, but it also is a general word for humans. So water is always emblematic of God's judgment. You can think about the flood in Genesis 6. You can think about the Nile in the Exodus, or I'm sorry, the Red Sea in the Exodus. And floods are almost always emblematic of God's judgment. And here you have the flood stopped at a town that means man. Now, the crossing also happens on Nisan 10. That is Lamb Selection Day. Now, if you were a Hebrew hearing this story, if you were living through it, or if you had heard about it a generation later and you hear Nisan 10, do you know what that is? December 25th. Everybody knows about Nisan 10. That's Lamb Selection Day. Lamb Selection Day. Several days before the Passover, you would select a lamb, a spotless lamb without blemish. The Hebrews had been remembering the Passover for 40 years through the wilderness. And that was the day on which they selected the lamb. Every Jew would have known. Years and years later. The Jordan River, by the way, is probably, if you count all the dips and the turns and the eddies and so on, it's thousands of miles of shoreline. Thousands of miles. There's a really interesting place in John 1:29 where you see Jesus' baptism being described. In 1:28 it says, this is John baptizing Christ. He says, I baptize with water. John replied, but among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who comes after me, the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. This happened at Bethany, on the other side of the Jordan, where John was baptizing. Most scholars agree that site of Jesus' baptism was pretty much right where Israel crossed the Jordan towards Jericho. There's actually a UNESCO historic site there marking Jesus, the site of his baptism. And not to put too fine a point on it, Those priests, I mean, these poor guys, have you thought about these guys a little bit? I'm in ministry. I empathize. They've been given the ark, and they're like, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to take the ark, and you're going to step into the raging, flooded, debris-filled wall of death. That's what you're going to do. Okay. And they do, and then God provides a miracle, and the water is stopped up. But then they stay there until every last person has crossed. Think about that. Now, if it were me, I'd be sitting there and be like, okay, guys, chop, hurry up. I don't know how long this is going to last. Let's go. And then I got to imagine, right? This is women and children. There is probably a really slow-moving family with toddlers, like way in the back, and you're like, come on, let's go. Because there you are, and you've stepped into the gap, you've stepped into the breach. You're holding back through the covenantal love of God, certain destruction and death. Those priests waded into the Jordan to keep Israel from being destroyed. And the better Joshua, the ultimate Joshua, wades into the ultimate Jordan. Sin, judgment, death. And he holds back the waters. He holds back the waters until the slowest of us, the most hobbled of us, the most feeble of us can get across. The King of Kings, the ultimate Joshua, he steps into the flood. Now, he didn't just suffer wrath. I calculated this out one time. I did a rough estimate. Since the first century, there's been 1 billion Christians. 1 billion Christians have lived on this planet. That means on the cross, when Jesus dies for the sins of the world, he takes 1 billion hells on his shoulder. He stood in the gap. He stood in the flood. He stopped the only thing that can actually really destroy us. Yeah, they would have been killed. They would have been killed by the Jordan if those floodwaters hadn't been held back, 100%. The only thing that can really destroy you is separation from God. That's the only thing that can really destroy you. And Jesus went into the flood. He faced the impassable obstacle, and he did it to display that the living God, he is alive. He is not a dead deity with an off switch. He goes with you. He will be with you wherever you go. And he says, in light of that, be strong, be courageous. I am with you. This concludes the teaching of God's word.